Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
Alright, hello everyone, welcome to the 8th episode of the Caffeine Stream, the podcast of caffeine philosophy. My name is CB Robertson, you can call me Chris, and I put out a question to see what everyone wanted to hear about next. And the overwhelming answer was more ancient Greek stuff, more classical Hellenic content, hopefully of a more positive variety, not just criticizing bad stuff that woke ideologues have put out in the past. So I thought I would go over someone who is arguably the heart of that tradition. Of classical Greeks, possibly you could really talk about them as the author of Greece, in much the way you might be able to talk about Jefferson as the author of America, and that person is Homer. Homer is most famous for writing the two great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're in many ways the most essential works of literature in the entire Western canon, more so than Shakespeare, more so than the Bible, I would argue, though I think that would be a little more controversial in certain circles. But there is a strong case for it, and there's a strong case for a connection between the two, particularly the Iliad, more so than the Odyssey. But that's a digression and a conversation perhaps for another time. Here, I really wanted to just introduce people to these books and to why why they would be considered so important in the first place. And to do that, I actually, not to be too self-promoting or anything, but I thought the best way to do that would be to begin by reading the first chapter of the book I wrote on the subject. I wrote a book about what was this, February or January? Recently, I think it was December of last year or January. The Hero and the Man, which is the thesis of it is that the Iliad and the Odyssey are best understood in relationship with each other. But the goal of me writing it was really just to aside from the thesis where I take a stance in support of some scholars and against others, but what I'm trying to do is give people the tools to appreciate and enjoy Homer. Because aside from unlocking all of Western culture, which it does because he's influenced all of Western culture, Homer is just a phenomenal artist. But, like much developed art, it takes a degree of initiation. It takes a degree of education in order to appreciate what you're looking at. As someone in construction and in the trades, it's funny how the development of certain skills gives you an ability to appreciate things that you otherwise wouldn't have even noticed. I can't walk into a store now without looking around and noticing how they ran the lights, where the exposed pipework is coming in. Oh, they just did those lights in exposed MC. How trashy. Or, oh, that pipework is very well executed. Look at those saddles, jumping over the beams like that. Someone knew what they were doing. You see things that you wouldn't have seen before as a result of the development of this skill. And understanding Homer is itself the development of that skill to a very great degree for the rest of the works that follow in Western literature and culture. But, unfortunately, it takes a little bit of foreknowledge in order to appreciate Homer in the first place. And so if you can just get people interested enough to enjoy Homer, that's half the battle. And so anyways, before I start reading my own book, I do want to take a moment to recommend a book that I think everybody should read, and that is Why Homer Matters by Adam Nichols. It's probably the single best introduction to Homer I've come across. Absolute joy of a read, and it's a very personal book too, which I think is a nice and appropriate touch for someone exploring Homer in a personal at the personal level. But that doesn't mean he doesn't go into the history of Lord and Perry and their exploration into the nature of poetic composition. He goes into, Bronze Age tin mines and talking about that culture and all kinds of relevant stuff that gives you the backdrop and the understanding necessary to see what's going on in the Iliad in particular. So, with that out of the way, I'll begin here. And just read a few pages of this. Most of it's just quotes. So, Homer, heart of the West. All of Western civilization flows from the words of Homer. His epic stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey, shaped the stories, art, and thought of Greek culture and all subsequent cultures that sprang from the Greek foundation. Homer's stories united all of Greece as Greece. Homer defined what it meant to be Greek, and Greece ultimately built the Western world. We can see it in our architecture and in our language. In fact, architecture is Greek in origin, stemming from archi, meaning first who commands, and tekton, meaning builder. Less visible but no less present is the Greek influence on our philosophy and religion. Homer gave birth to our aesthetic ideals, especially our ideals regarding how men ought to be. It would behoove the Western man then, perhaps in pursuit of Socrates' advice to know thyself, to come to understand Homer. Among writers, poets, classicists, and theologians, this opinion about the influence of Homer is not much debated, but taken as a kind of given. Yet the precise nature of this influence seems less clear. Critics praise different aspects of his significance: his clarity, his energy, his directness and objectivity, the beauty of his depictions, the moral values conveyed in his stories, or simply his longevity. Quote, "The first teacher and beginner of all these beauties of tragedy," was Plato on Homer. Homer's poems were writ from a free fury, an absolute and full soul. Virgil's out of a courtly, laborious, and altogether imitory spirit. Not a simile he hath but is Homer's, not an invention, person, or disposition, but is wholly or originally built upon Homerical foundations, and in many places hath the very words Homer useth. All Homer's books are such as have been precedents ever since of all sorts of poems, imitating none, nor ever worthily imitated of any. George Chapman, 1598. But when to examine every part he came, nature and Homer were he found the same. Alexander Pope, 1711. But what lies as the womb of the Hellenic behind the Homeric world? In the latter, by the extremely artistic definiteness and the calm and purity of the lines, we are already lifted far above the purely material amalgamation. Its colors, by an artistic deception, appear lighter, milder, warmer. Its men, in this colored, warm illumination, appear better and more sympathetic. But where do we look, if no longer guided and protected by Homer's hand, we step backwards into the pre-Homeric world? Only the night and horror, into the products of a fancy accustomed to the horrible. Friedrich Nietzsche, 1872. It was Homer who gave laws to the artist. It was Homer who inspired the poet. Francis Wayland, 1922. But anyhow, it is true that this, which is our first poem, might very well be our last poem, too. It might well be the last word as well as the first word spoken by man about his mortal lot, as seen by mortal vision. If the world becomes pagan and perishes, the last man left alive would do well to quote the Iliad and die. G.K. Chesterton, 1925. It is hardly possible to overestimate the importance for Western literature of the Iliad's demonstration that the fall of an enemy, no less than that of a friend or leader, is tragic and not comic. With the Iliad, once for all, an objective and disinterested element enters into the poet's vision of human life. Without this element, poetry is merely instrumental to various social aims, to propaganda, to amusement, to devotion, to instruction. With it, it acquires the authority that since the Iliad it has never lost, an authority based, like the authority of science, on the vision of nature as an impersonal order. Northrop Frye, 1957. So I'll conclude my reading of my own book there. But I hope the point is made that this is Homer's contributions are not just, critical contributions to the Western canon, but are in many ways the foundation from which everything else derived. And I don't mean to exaggerate. It's become a joke between my wife and I now, that ever since I started going on about Homer, who I've been interested in for the better part of a decade and a half, but who I only really dove deeply into in the last 3 or 4 years. She notes that, God, he's everywhere now. Now that you've pointed out, I've begun to notice him in other books that she's read before but hadn't noticed the Homeric influence. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that influence now. I can't give a really good summary of these books, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are, by the way, not the only things Homer wrote. Homer did write a series of hymns to the various gods that are also quite well-known and famous in Hellenic, especially Reconstructionist circles. But the Iliad and the Odyssey are really the important works, and I think we can give at least a thematic overview of what's going on. And the way I would do that, I think, is by talking about one of my favorite Homer scholars, Greg Nagy, who I mentioned in a previous podcast. Greg Nagy talks about Homeric poetry in its form, and Homeric epic was composed with a particular structure to it, and it's a structure that has comparisons to modern copywriting, modern journalism, at least in the manner in which the entire subject matter of the story is supposed to be, ideally, condensed and outlined in the first lines. So if you open a newspaper, or you're scrolling through your news feed on your phone or whatever, good copywriting begins with a headline that in a couple of words summarizes what the story is about. And then there'll be a subheadline that gives a little bit more detail. And then after you read that subheadline, you read, the first paragraph or two of the story itself. And the first paragraph or two aren't a chronological account, but a slightly more broad summary of the contents of the entire story. And then by about the second or third paragraph, it begins a chronological account and maybe throws in some quotes and things like that. So there's a structure to good copywriting. And in the same way, Homeric epic has this kind of structure that begins by introducing the themes in the first few lines. So I'll start by reading the Iliad, and I'll read it in English, but I'll try to introduce the important Greek words, because there are some Greek words that don't have quite correct English translations, that don't quite capture what's being summarized, and then we'll carry on from there. So, the Iliad, translated in this case by Robert Fagles. Book 1. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion feasts for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin muse when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. All right, so the first word to focus on here is this word that Fagles translates as rage. The actual word is menis, or as in actual conjugation, menin. Menin aedethea pele. Anyways, this menis is, it's translated as rage or wrath or anger even in some cases. But there's some scholarship done, especially by Leonard Molnar, that points to an etymology that's much deeper and darker of menace as a kind of indiscriminate vengeance and indiscriminate sanction against the world for violations of the divine hierarchy, of the divine order. So if someone is rank is not respected in the especially among the gods, right? Then consequences befall, and those consequences aren't meted out in any kind of just or fair way. They affect everybody, and so it unites the very concept of menace unites everybody in a desire to uphold the divine order. And so for those of you who don't know, the story of the Iliad begins, as we just read, with the story of Agamemnon and Achilles being at odds with each other. And this is because Agamemnon feels that Achilles is not respecting him, and Achilles feels that Agamemnon is not respecting Achilles in his place. And so this concept of what is your proper place in this hierarchy is a sort of not just an essential question, but it's at least implied to be the question of the Iliad that we see opening up. So that's one important word, meinin. Another important word that we see mentioned here, and here I think Fagel's actually slightly, I won't say dropped the ball, but he didn't translate it as I would have when he says great fighters' souls. Hurling down to the house of death, so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls. The word used there, that he has translated as great fighters, is heroon, which literally means, more literally translated means, who were heroes. Now, in the Proto-Indo-European reconstructed language that we can, what we know of it, the concept of a hero seemed to be a protector, just anyone who defended you from or your tribe. What we see in the Iliad is a development of this concept of a hero. The hero becomes someone greater than merely a protector. A hero is identified as someone who is dead on the battlefield. Their bodies are being eaten by the birds and the dogs. But they're immortalized. They're immortalized in song and in poetry. Song and poetry like the Iliad itself. The Iliad is that promise. It is itself the medium of immortality that it offers in compensation for the sacrifice of those strong souls who are heroes. And then we get this line, and the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Dios de eteleie tobule. So aside from the obvious implication of fate, the gods have a will that it's not the place of man to really mess with. The humans can really have no effect on the plans of God and the will of Zeus in this way. So yeah, we have this emphasis on this idea of fate, and it's an important thing to remember when we read the opening of the Odyssey, because we see a much different depiction of the relationship between man and God in this regard. And I think that's the really important stuff to cover, though there is one more essential word that's worth mentioning here, and it's not in the opening lines, unfortunately, not explicitly, but it's sort of alluded to by these other concepts, and that's this word Kleos. Kleos is usually translated as glory, but it's not just any kind of glory, because there's another kind of glory that's offered at one point to Achilles, which he rejects, which the Greeks called time, and that's honor in the form of material goods. So like, a trophy might be a form of time. Kleos is glory specifically in song. and poetry. And as Greg Nagy points out, Kleos also refers to the song itself that conveys this glory. And so the promise of heroism depicted by the story of the Iliad is the promise of an unwilting glory, a glory that can never die, even when your body dies. And so the whole project of heroism is the exchange of your mortal body, which is doomed to die anyways, for the hope of immortality in epic, for immortality in this unwilting glory that never fades. That is the hope. And all of that is alluded to in just the first few lines. And then the story is that dynamic playing out, and the tragic and horrible, and yet at the same time somehow beautiful consequences of that. So now let's jump over to the Odyssey, and let's take a look at the first lines there. Let me pull this up here. So we have, and here we're going to do a little bit more than just the 7 lines. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. The blind fools, they devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from sight the day of their return. Launch out on his story, Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time, too. So, the first word in this epic is Andra, which means man. Andra moi enepe musa malapul. So Fagles begins with sing, but it's really man, me tell, malapula. So there's a kind of symmetry to the Iliad where he's invoking the muse to tell this song through him, the rhapsode, through the poet. The gods themselves are speaking this story, and the poet is only this medium to convey the story that is greater than the poet himself. But here he's asking to tell of this man, that man of twists and turns, polutropon, which means of twists and turns, but like going this way and that way. Some translators have translated the word polutropon literally as just complicated. I think I like the way Fagles takes it as of twists and turns. It's more true to the original sense of the term. Driven time and again off course, once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. Learned their minds. Minds is noon, which is a conjugation of noos. And noos is a very key word for the Odyssey. It's sort of Odysseus' superpower, actually. And it means mind, it's sometimes translated as intelligence, but Greg Nagy translates it as mental connection. And what we see in the Odyssey is this noos, and this power of the mind seems strongest at points of mental connection, where one character connects with another or with home, and is weakest when they lose focus, when they are disconnected. So I think there's something very, very powerful in the nuance that Greg Nagy brings to understanding what's going on in this idea. So when many cities of men he saw and learned their minds, the fact that he's learning the minds of other men in their cities itself sort of contextualizes what Homer is talking about with this word Noos. So, anyways, many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home, but he could not save them from disaster. So again, we have this disaster that we heard in the Iliad, but here it's of a different kind. Hard as he strove, the recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. Well, that's not fate. In the Iliad, we're seeing this disaster is the consequence of the will of Zeus moving towards its end. But here, the blind fools, the word in the Iliad, or in the Odyssey, in the Greek, actually means something like children. The blind fools, they devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from the sight the day of their return. It's a very poetic flourish on Fegel's part. Unfortunately, that's not exactly the wording in the Greek, but still cool. And then he concludes with, launch out on his story, start from where you will, and sing for our time too. And what I love about that conclusion for the line, which is how it's done in the Greek, is it isn't chronological. In the Iliad, we have, it begins at the point of disagreement between Agamemnon and Achilles, and then it progresses there to the conclusion. And once Agamemnon and Achilles are, reunited and come back together, the story ends. With the Odyssey, it sort of picks up media res. It sort of begins in the middle, and then you go backwards and hear about what happened before that. And then you jump back to where, and then you slowly progress forward to where you started from, and then it goes forward from there. And the fact that he is asking the muse to sing for our time too, bear in mind, the Odyssey and the Iliad were written about 400 years after the events of the Trojan War took place. Troy was about 1200 BC. Homer was in the 8th century BC. So, again, like 500 years had elapsed. But what he's invoking is a sense of timelessness that's conveyed in the unchronological structure of this story. And it makes it feel somehow more timeless, but it's also more in the present. In the Iliad, the nature of heroism being described is it's past time oriented. There are all these instances of old men berating young men about heroes of the past who are much greater than the soldiers of the present. Phoenix does this with Achilles in Book 9. Nestor does this with Achilles and Agamemnon in Book 1, where he's saying, look, I served with great men much greater than you, so listen to me in my... it's got that past orientation. But at the same time, a future mind orientation. It's looking in the past and in the future. And one gets the sense that this sense of fate that permeates the Iliad is connected with this focus on the past and this focus on the future. In the Odyssey, it's all connected but also present-oriented. And in that view, there's a sense of responsibility and of the gods not being in control. And I want to read this passage also from Book 1 of the Odyssey, in which Zeus is actually complaining about this. He says, recalling Aegisthus, Zeus harangued the immortal powers. Ah, how shameless the way these mortals blame the gods. From us alone, they say, come all their miseries, yes, but they themselves, with their own reckless ways, compound their pains beyond their proper share. And it perfectly summarizes it almost feels like a change in tone that in Homer himself between the writing of the Iliad and the writing of the Odyssey. Now, I should hasten to add that it's widely believed by scholars that, and this is thanks largely to Lord and Perry, who did a lot of research on how epic song was actually composed in, it's called composition and performance. They were literally composing it on the fly as they sang the song as part of a tradition, and they had certain stories that they would riff on and develop and refine over subsequent generations of rhapsodes performing these stories. And so it's believed that the Iliad has the signs of that the Iliad was the culmination of this composition and performance tradition that predated writing and had like 400 years to be refined to such a high point that we end up with this epic poem that Homer really just added the final tweaks and refinements to. That's the idea, anyways. And we get this wonderful snapshot of this pre-linguistic world by the fact that the Iliad was written down in a way that previous iterations were not. So that's sort of the cool anthropological side of this whole thing. But the Odyssey seems a little different, and it seems to reflect a different worldview than that conveyed in the Iliad. And again, it's one that rejects heroism in a way. At least it rejects this idealistic desire to be immortalized in song, and instead replaces this desire for Kleos, for glory, with Nostos, with homecoming, with the idea of reconnection with home and with your family and with your roots. So, like I said, this is not by no means a comprehensive and absolute introduction to the Iliad and the Odyssey and to Homer and to Greece. But I hope it's a thematic starting point that can at least help people see what's going on thematically and what Homer is trying to do or trying to convey through himself that predated even the poet. And you can see just how influential that's been. These ideas of glory and heroism and homecoming and this concept of mind and mental connection that we see so deeply entrenched, not just in our culture, but we can see their source in Homer. And there's a certain joy in being able to see that, but there's also a certain joy in being able to understand and see Homer in a new light that makes the reading of the stories themselves more pleasurable. So I think I'm going to call that good for now. I'm sure this won't be the last time we talk about Homer. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.